We're very excited to have Dr. Bruce here with us today, again, to talk about planning and implementing literacy lessons, including story boxes, experience books, and choice making. A little bit about Susan before we begin. Dr. Susan Bruce is Professor Emerita, Boston College. Dr. Bruce's research areas are communication development and intervention for learners with severe disabilities, including deafblindness, assessment, action research. Dr. Bruce has published more than 100 articles and chapters, with 70 being about learners who are deafblind. Dr. Bruce remains active in research, consultation to schools and families, and professional development. She currently serves on the Deafblind International Research Group, supporting research in under-resourced countries. She has also raised a daughter with multiple disabilities, including visual impairments. So thank you very much, Dr. Bruce, for coming, and we're excited to hear your session today.
Thank you for the intro. I appreciate it. So welcome, everyone. As we were just told, our mission today is to talk about what I tend to call classic literacy lessons, meaning that every teacher serving children with visual impairments or deafblindness needs to be able to do well. So the talk will be divided up into really four parts. In the first part, I'm going to spend a little time on some background information because it's going to appear in the later segments of the talk. And then we'll spend about a quarter of our time on story boxes and about a quarter on experience books, and then less than that on choice making. And I'll be talking about how to make choice making meaningful, or what I call authentic choice making. So let's get started then. And thank you for the opportunity. So our objectives is that you will understand the expanded view of literacy, which I imagine many of you already practice in your everyday work. The goals of literacy lessons, what we're trying to achieve. I want to define personalized and individualized. Those are not synonymous terms. I want to make sure we all have an understanding of saliency, and it's important to literacy, and also distancing in the development of language. And that's all in the background section. And then, as I said, we'll talk about story boxes and then experience books, and then finally, authentic choice making. And there are resources that are embedded with links into the slide. All right, so what is traditional literacy? The general public, without any background that we all share, would tend to think of literacy as being able to read and write. And we can build on that, can't we? We can think of different ways of reading, including reading objects and sequencing objects. And we can think of writing in different ways, also writing to include drawing, for example. So the general public, without background in disability or literacy, might think that traditional literacy is something you do after you are linguistic, meaning you achieve language first and then you develop literacy. But we don't think of it that way, do we, in the field of deafblindness? And really, for all children, there's significant experience, more than exposure. We hope more engaged actual experiences with literacy long before they have developed expressive language. And we build on that kind of thinking then in the field of deafblindness. So we say in the field of deafblindness that we have a need for an expanded view of literacy that is inclusive of all learners. So we want those pre-linguistic learners to be included when we're talking about experiences with literacy. We also have a strong bent towards seeing literacy lessons as a context in which we work on communication and language skills. So instead of seeing it as something you achieve first and then literacy, we see literacy lessons as a context then to work on communication skills. We think beyond print and braille for reading and writing to include other ways, other forms or modes of representation, like objects, textures, and so on, line drawings, perhaps, depending on the individual's vision. We think about the use of high and low technologies. We think about read alouds and we think about shared reading, which those two are actually examples of additional classic literacy lessons that we need to know how to do well, but we're not addressing those today, but I'll distinguish them for you. So a read aloud can integrate multiple forms of communication and expression, but a read aloud is when a more experienced person generally is reading to someone, whereas shared reading, the word share kind of gives you the clue that the word with might appear. Shared reading is when you create opportunities for both individuals to have reading expression. So in terms of children who are deafblind, if an adult's reading to them and they're in a more passive mode, that's a read aloud. If instead they're taking turns reading, maybe even sequencing objects to represent a story, then if the child is doing a reading activity, even though it may be in expanded ways, that's what we want actually, then that's shared reading. So I would invite you to look at the Canadian resource, the POPDB resource, specifically the literacy section. So let me test this out. I don't know that this will appear once I've already highlighted the slide. If not, I can kind of tell you about each of the links instead. No, I don't, that doesn't appear, does it? No, it's not in green. Annie, can you tell me?
No.
Okay, then I'll describe them because if I close in and out and copy and paste all these links, it's going to take a lot of time, I think. So instead, what I'll do is just describe a little bit. So this particular resource really gives you nice background information, a bit more than background information on why literacy is so important to deafblindness. It also shares some instructional ideas and some resources. So you'll want to make sure you have a copy of the PowerPoint so you could open these links because I couldn't do them justice anyway in an hour and a half because I probably have 10 of these links to Canadian resources roughly in the talk today. So those, if you haven't seen them, will be important for you to explore on your own then. Excuse me, let me get a sip. All right, so let's think a little bit about the goals we hold when we offer literacy lessons, and that's aligned with the expanded view of literacy. Oftentimes, we're working on shared or joint attention, right? And often that begins with sharing positive affect, positive emotions. We're thinking about exposure, maybe experience is a better word with language. We're thinking about what concepts we want to convey and teach within each of our literacy lessons, which are very often repeated many times to build concepts. We want the children to have receptive experiences with literacy skills long before we test them, and meaning long before we expect them to tell us that they can do these things. So we want to talk with them about the main idea. We want to talk about the characters. We might talk about setting and pair it with the sign where, if the child is a signer or will be a signer. So we're exposing them and giving them experiences in a thoughtful kind of way about literacy concepts and principles before we're ever going to expect them to be able to share their ideas about these notions of literacy. We're going to build communication skills. It might be turn taking. That could happen, for example, in the case of the shared reading lessons. We're definitely going to focus on vocabulary and so on. We want to offer writing experiences across the modes of forms of communication that are meaningful to the child, always thinking about the child's current or possible expressive modes or forms of communication then. We also can work on developing sequencing skills. So it's not just main idea, character, setting. We also want to think about the sequence of literacy events, just like we teach them about sequences when we establish routines for their lessons. And sequencing then in terms of literacy is also part of working on time concepts, like what happened first, what happened second or next, whatever language is appropriate to each child then. We can also work on book handling skills. the front of the book, the back of the book, how to turn a page, how to handle a book with care, and so on. And of course, some of these books may be books that you've made with the child, such as experience books, as opposed to those you may have purchased. And let me pause here in case somebody wants to add something about their own goals for literacy lessons that I didn't perhaps share.
This is Annie here. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but maybe I'll,
Okay. All
yeah.
right. Well, we'll go forward. We can check again at the end of the background segment then. So there are some key concepts that are really important in our field. And I find that sometimes, even when preparation in deafblindness happens at the university, these ideas may not be expressed strongly enough. So I want to take a little bit of time with these. So because of deafblindness, the children have a tremendous reduction in observational learning, which generally happens through our sense of vision and our sense of hearing. And of course, I acknowledge that over 90% of the children have some functional vision or hearing, but still they're missing a great deal of information that we gain through observation. And then there's a second kind of learning called incidental learning. Incidental learning is not the same as observational, but they kind of connect and overlap. And with incidental learning, then you didn't set out with a mindfulness to tackle something and learn it, but you just sort of picked it up like things we overhear or things that capture our eye. And so we pay attention to it and we learn something. So both of those types of experiences are reduced. So that's part of that first bullet, what I'm referencing. But the other part is really a concerted effort to make sure that children who are deaf-blind have repeated opportunities with experiences because that will enrich their life. It'll change the quality of their life. It also grounds all of language and literacy, doesn't it? You have to have the experiences to have the comprehension, to have the vocabulary, to really have the whole idea of what's happening. And then not only do you need to have the experiences, but we need to watch the quality of those experiences because often they're getting some little part of that whole experience, but there may be a difficulty in connecting those parts or in getting a more gestalt or whole sense of an experience. So these are all challenges that we never, ever want to lose sight on. They're really at the crux of teaching children who are deaf-blind, especially congenitally deaf-blind. The next one is saliency, and I'll have a special slide on that, so I won't need to say a whole lot right here. But just think about it right now as being what's important or noticeable to each individual who's deaf-blind. And then I'll talk about individualization and personalization, which I want to differentiate. Please don't use them synonymously, although in the literature we generally do, which is incorrect. All right, so let's talk saliency then. So saliency is really important when you're creating story boxes that are not with commercially produced materials. It's important when you're selecting tangible symbols from a set of APH or other produced symbols. Saliency means that you're thinking about what is most important about an experience, what best represents it for a specific child who is deaf-blind. And that's the beauty of our field, isn't it? Tuning into the perceptions, the experiences of another person rather than relying on our own. That's really so much of what we do. It's at the heart of our work. So this applies then across forms or modes of communication, thinking about the objects you select for a story box to represent a particular experience that you shared with the child. Same thing when you're selecting pictures. Same thing when you're selecting key vocabulary to work on. So if we were going to go to grandma's house, the experience that a sibling had and what was most salient to the sibling could be very, very different from the most salient part of that experience for the child who's deaf-blind or for their parents. So we want to be tuned into the child. That's that child-guided piece that we're really good at in our field. And so, how do we do that? We watch for what draws emotions. Saliency is often reflected in the emotions of the child. And of course, we're going to build on those happy emotions. Things that are memorable are often rooted in emotion as well. We want to watch what they touch, what they pay attention to, what they engage with, what they show emotion with. And in engagement, think about the length of engagement. So if we're going to a park and there's different areas like the swings and maybe a sandbox area and the slides, if the child is able to, whatever the child is able to experience, we'll watch to see what brought them joy and what where they seem to want to spend most of their time and where their energy was going. And those activities will be the most important to represent if we were to create an experience book about going to the neighborhood park. So watch what they touch, watch their engagement. And this also is so important because if you honor the principle of saliency, it will actually help them to make meaning of the literacy lessons because it reflects their memory, their emotionally charged memory, like bodily emotional traces that many of the Europeans have written about, or some of the Europeans have written about. And it also helped them draw out those memories through your literacy lessons. So it's important on multiple levels. So we have to be out there as missionaries helping other people who are new to our field understand why saliency is important. I believe teachers can honor that principle when they're selecting tangible symbols. Even if they order a commercially produced set, then you only pick out and use the ones that would be salient for the child you're selecting them for. All right. So next, I want to differentiate the terms individualized and personalized, and I have to honor the early childhood field because that's the group of professionals and families who did this first. But we have been doing this for a long time without using the right terms in the field of deafblindness. So let's tackle individualizing or individualization first. So this is when we consider all of the modifications. A modification is a change in content. So think curriculum. An accommodation is different. An accommodation would be enlargement, amplification, and so on. So when we individualize, we consider positioning, the preparation of the materials, all of the strategies we need to use with a specific child. And we think then we can broadly say around modifications and accommodations that will support the child to engage well in the lesson. Personalized is different. And oh, are we good at this? And I so much want the field of deafblindness to own this, just like they do in early childhood. Personalizing literacy is when we have literacy lessons that are about the child's or adult's life. So they're reflective of the individual's lived experiences. That's the personal part and personalized. This is critical for individuals who are deafblind due to their reduced observational and incidental learning that I explained a few minutes ago. And these experiences then are important because they undergird meaning making within these personalized lessons. So we can grow as a field in using these terms and applying them. So when we're offering literacy lessons, of course, we're going to have commercially published books, and we might even have some sets of mass-produced objects that go with those books, and we might take the ones that appear to be salient for an individual child or could be salient for that child. But we also need a significant amount of teacher, parent, or other professional created experience books and story boxes that are made based on the child's individual experiences. And some of those now are done, of course, on the iPad as well, depending again on the child's vision and the child's hearing. So we also are thinking of this whole idea of personalized literacy as a culturally sustaining or culturally affirming pedagogy because these books then are reflecting their way of living, right? So there is a lot we can do as a field in growing our thinking around personalized literacy as a culturally affirming pedagogy. All right. So the next big idea is distancing and how it relates to language and literacy. So I know some folks have stepped very far away from developmentalism, and I understand some of the reasons for that, but I'm going to be just very transparent in saying I believe it has a strong place in our thinking about language development for the children who are deafblind especially, but for other children also. So from the time we're born, distancing occurs. So in the very, very beginning, we might not understand that we're a separate being. And this all happens very quickly with children who are typically developing, children with no disabilities. So with typical experiences, whatever that might mean. So early distancing first happens when you understand yourself separate from other people, like separate from your primary caregiver, separate from objects in your environment, that yes, you're part of the environment in a given moment, but you're not stable in that environment. So you understand over time the separation. These happen largely in the early months of life, but they are more difficult to understand if you're deaf-blind, particularly depending on the level of vision, functional vision you have, how much functional hearing you have. Then the middle distancing experiences happen really between referent and representation. So the thing we're going to represent, here, I'll hold up my glass of water. So let's say this is the referent. This is what I want to represent. The interpreters can help me here because I only have one hand right now. And we could call it a drink. We could use the verb, we're going to drink. And drink then is the representation, in this case, in sign language. But it could also be through a picture. And for early learners, early communicators, we would want to make sure it looks as close to the thing we're representing, which is the referent, as possible. So in the beginning, there's very little space between the referent and the representation. And that's why we often use whole objects, isn't it? And over time, we build this distance. Okay, because what we're doing is we're working gradually toward more advanced communication and toward language. In order to achieve language, it is not enough to only understand abstract representations, and they are symbols. Another thing we do in the field is we misuse the term symbol. Symbols are always abstract. Otherwise, they're actually representations, but I don't quibble over tangible symbols because it's been a term we've used for a long time, although it's actually incorrect. Some are icons, some are indices, and some are symbols. And you need to know where your child is in terms of understanding representations so you can select the right level and nurture them towards symbolism. I recognize that some people believe that if you offer the same symbols over and over and over and over again over time, they'll learn some of them. So I'm presenting another point of view that I would build toward that. And particularly because congenital deafblindness especially interferes with the development of distancing, we have to be much more systematic in how we approach it. It doesn't happen by accident. What we're asking them to do is to achieve distancing, which is absolutely essential combined with symbolization for developing language. But we're asking them to develop distancing with a loss in distance senses of vision and hearing. And those two distance senses are what support, along with cognition, the understanding of distancing. So it's really important that we not lose sight of this as a field. All right, so then later distancing. So now the child's using perhaps some symbols, still using some indices, which are understood by association with the referent. They're using some that look very much or feel very much like the representation, they're icons, but they're building toward abstract representations, and that's positive, even though they're using a mix. That's okay. Then what happens with later distancing, and this is to be celebrated. I can think of children where I saw that for the first time and I was so excited. Later distancing is when they can refer to something that happened in a different place and time. So another literacy lesson we could offer would be interactive journals. And I've written about those. And I think the National Center on Deafblindness has something on that still from that work. And that's when you might have, instead of a note home, a little journal with just 3 or 4 pages. And it shows some primary activities that happened at school. And then it goes home, and whoever is there with the child in the home, caregiver, caretaker, parent, can review that with them. And so both sides, the school and the family, need to be willing to do that. Or you can do it across subcontexts, like different classrooms within the school. If the family, has a lot that's occupying them, and at that time it's not an intervention they could do. But the point is, we can teach to distancing. We can teach distancing in very concrete ways. And one of them is to help the kids with this separation in time and space. So when something happens in the classroom and the child does something that shows you that they're thinking about it, and maybe they're in the adapted PE room, it's like, woo, that is a big moment. And it could be the repetition of a motor act that they were doing. It could be a vocalization they did during an SLP session down the hall, and now it appears in the classroom. And that tells you they're remembering it, they're connecting it. It's different people, it's a different room, it's a different time. That is all what distancing is about. And that puts them a bit closer to being linguistic. So symbolization, symbols, knowing symbols, abstract representations, and distancing are critical to the development of language. They're not absolutely necessary. By the way, when kids understand symbols, you also see emergence of symbolic play. One doesn't cause the other. It's this underlying cognitive development then that results in it appearing in play and appearing in communication then. All right. We also talk in our field about literacy-rich environments. So if you're deaf-blind or if you're blind, you won't have as many opportunities to know why other people engage in literacy. So family members can share, oh, I'm making a note so I don't forget. Computer literacy, shopping lists, and so on. So again, that relates to that reduction in observational and incidental learning. Of course, we want to have sufficient interesting literacy materials and keep them in a predictable place, particularly the library of their own experience books. We want to make sure we have different types of literacy opportunities. Shared reading, read alouds are good too. And you can look at the Paths to Literacy as well as works by Mackenzie for some additional ideas. All right, so let's pause here and see if you have any questions on this first segment.
Annie here again. I'm not seeing any questions. I'll wait a minute here. But I did have something just on the distancing, and you
Yeah,
were talking about the teaching to distancing and that great
yeah,
example of, oh, something happened in the gym,
yeah.
and just trying to use that motor, repetition. Do you have any just like tips, I guess, for teachers or interveners on in the busyness of those moments when they got the student and they're holding the iPad and the other things, and there's so much going on just recognizing those moments and remembering to do that. Like that's
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I
important.
would praise memory, if you're going to sign or say, you remembered, good memory, or that's wonderful, and show positive affect because this is a really, really big deal. Kids who are deafblind tend to be anchored to the current situation, to the here and now. And so just encouraging it will be very helpful and being responsive. I'll tell you, there's one event that comes to my mind. As I recall, he was like level 6 on the Matrix. And so and oftentimes you'll see this later distancing right around level 5, level 6. You won't see it in the earlier kids, or else they've probably been misassessed, frankly. And this little boy wanted something up in the cupboard, and his teacher told him later in the day, and he understood now and later. And he understood that as differentiated from in a few minutes. Okay. So then he could handle later, would be sometime that day, basically. And then she became ill and had to leave. And a new adult came in and he asked to be picked up, asked to be picked up. And then he's gesturing, maybe not a true point, but gesturing up to that cupboard. And I'm like, wow, okay, so now we've distanced across people and with someone he doesn't even know. Now, there's a problem there, that maybe he didn't understand that the teacher didn't tell her this important information, but that wouldn't be surprising. So I think we watch for it, we encourage it, and we actually create lessons to support it. Like having a book about something that happens in one part of the school shared somewhere else. Having that library of books, there's a Canadian resource in here about experience books. Having those books in a place where the child can locate them and they can revisit a book about, well, it could be on Easter, it could be on a class field trip or anything else. All of those things that we do story boxes about an experience as opposed to a commercially produced book would all help with distancing. But
Mm,
I'm absolutely certain after decades of experience, we have to program for this. It
yeah.
was kind of the piece we left out when we were basing our child-guided approach on Werner and Kaplan. They wrote about this when they studied Helen Keller and other people who were deaf-blind, but our field didn't take that piece with it so much. But there's a reference on it, and you can read more about it. But yeah, there's a number of things we can do. And what we're talking about today very much relates to supporting distancing.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Sandy, I think we have one question. Sandy, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate it very well. I've really appreciated your discussion about distancing. So my question is around something you said about, exposure to the same symbols over and over again. And it just made me flash to a student of mine who is using an AAC device.
Yeah.
And with this constant discussions with the SLPs who feel that just, repeated exposure to the symbol that they'll understand what it means. And
Yeah.
I'm and I'm just wondering what you would say to that.
I would probably explain similar to what I did earlier and then expand on it. But I absolutely respect that this is a division in the field of special education. And it comes from a good place from the standpoint that people who believe that exposure will do it and practice will do it, don't want to see children lose the opportunity to be exposed to symbols. I think we can give receptive exposure to symbols to some degree, but I would want to make sure that we're honoring where the child is with their current cognitive development and so forth. So there are two very different camps of thought. I just happen to believe that if you start a little bit above where they are in the old Vygotsky zone of proximal development and nurture it along, they'll have more experiences with success. If I teach at a level that they're not ready for, they're going to feel a sense of failure. I'm also concerned, it happened with my own child in adulthood. I was very, very excited that she was getting SLP services. But then when I went to see the session, she really couldn't see what was being represented. It wasn't possible for her to view it. But what she did is she learned top right, bottom right. She learned by location. And some people praise that, but I also think that can be kind of limiting as opposed to other forms of communication. So you have to figure out which camp you belong to and then figure out how to have the conversation. I know we've talked about that out in New England, that it's a conversation that needs to happen because there's arguments to be made on both sides. So I just wanted to be transparent of which role I'm in, when I talk about this. But I respect that someone else might feel a different way. I just believe on supporting success and making sure the kids aren't tested before they're taught and making sure that they have a reasonable opportunity to be successful. I think you get there faster and with more of a healthy sense of ego when you nurture to success. And I don't think exposure to symbols, go by your data. If
Yeah,
they're not mastering it, go by your data. And if you're introducing some things that are icons, they resemble or feel like the referent, and they're learning those, but they're not mastering the symbols, then I think you know your story.
yeah. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in
Yeah.
total agreement. I wanted to hear
Yeah.
you speak to that. Thank you.
It's really a tough one. Blame it on me if you have to. I'm old, it doesn't matter. But yes,
Thank
I
you.
hear it. I hear it almost every week. Or make a special case for the kids who are deafblind if you have to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we have a long history of building on success in increments. We just do. All right. So classic literacy lessons, these in my elder years, I've decided to name as such: story boxes, experience books. I added choice making. I know that one's a little bit on the edge there, but I call it a classic literacy lesson. Daily schedules and calendars, which I know you have a tremendous amount of expertise. The journals that are interactive and address distancing, and shared reading. All right. So story boxes, I bet you've done them already. They are a collection of objects that correspond with particular activity or experience. And so they can be commercially produced objects that correspond to a commercially published book. They can, however, be something you make, and they can be something you do before experience books, They might lead to an experience book, perhaps, or not. And so you're out doing something with the child or the family is, and they have a little bin, little basket, a dollar store plastic basket, wherever it might be, and they notice what the child pays attention to, whether it's visual or tactual, think multimodality, and they gather just a few things, like a birthday party, for example. What was the child really interested in? Probably not the same things as the birthday boy or girl, right? It could be something really different. And it could be a reflection on what they actually did see and what they actually did have the opportunity to touch. So keep thinking multimodality. And so it is best then if we honor the principle of saliency, and if those objects that go into the story box are gathered with the learner, and then not long afterwards, and here we get into distancing again, we could have shaped this all and twisted as a topic of distancing, then you review those with the child and you talk, whatever communication mode is functional for the child, about what happened. And now you're talking about something in the past and in another place. So these lessons that we do are connected to distancing then. So be sure you honor the principle of saliency, watch for emotion. This is a sample story box, or it could be a story box. So it's the Very Hungry Caterpillar, and there are materials available. But you could also gather your own fruit, which would be nicer than plastic fruit, right? And the caterpillar, well, we probably don't want people touching caterpillars. They're kind of hard to find sometimes too. So you can gather something that's maybe better than this, but this could be a starting point. And I want to respect that some of us had or do have classrooms with, a lot of kids in them. I had one with 10 kids who were deafblind one year. Well, actually, a couple of years. So, and all at very different levels communicatively. So sometimes we don't have as much time as we would like to make everything ourselves. So select wisely. When you select from a commercial set, you don't have to use all of it, use part of it. And if your school is limited in funds, then you may be making these yourselves. That happens a lot too. But this is the idea. So it can be part of a set of materials that goes with a commercially published book. Here's another example. Let's see, this is Good Night Moon, and we see tangible symbols. Yeah, I would say they're mostly symbols, not icons. And then we see some materials that have been gathered that go with Goodnight Moon. And that's a lot. That's probably too many. So you don't have to have an object to go with everything in a published book. You could pick out the key pages that are of interest, the ones where there are concepts that you're emphasizing with a particular child, and just do the other pages more quickly, I guess we could say, with less emphasis. All right. So this was a picture from a book that a teacher made. She was in one of my research studies, and this child has she's deafblind but has a great deal of functional vision. That's a rather cheap description. I'm sorry. This is one that the child made. The reason I said that is this child doesn't particularly have an issue with glare the way we usually are so concerned about. So what she's done is she's taken a published book and she's separated out the pages and put them on a black background with some film over it to protect the pages. And the rings are nice because now she can lay the pages flat when they're engaged in shared reading or with an accompanying story box. And then she's taken the text and she's adapted it according to the recommendations. We do see a little glare. We know we battle over the glare, don't we? Because we like some sort of cover to preserve it from body liquids and so forth, body fluids and so forth, but then it takes down the visual quality. So, but this worked for this particular child very well. And then she's added a tactile element on this particular page. So there'd be something for the child to touch. That's more about interest level and putting the facial parts also because they're working on the names of those. But again, it's more for interest than because of the child's level of functional vision. All right, so when we're thinking of instructional decisions and strategies, then we have to think about which objects we're going to select. to include in the story box. Again, it could be about a published book or it could be about an experience, and there isn't a book present. Both are fine. Combination is fine. We want to think about the vocabulary we want to cover. So maybe on that book picture I was just showing you, maybe she's going to emphasize under and on, or facial features, eyes, nose, mouth. And maybe that also influenced her decisions about what to include as tactile information then. If paired with a commercially published book, you have to consider then how you're going to coordinate the use of the objects. So this particular teacher had an opportunity for the child to touch, and they signed and talked about the different objects in the story box before she read the book. So I respect the idea that when you're reading a book, you kind of hope for a little bit of a flow with the book. So you have to think about how the objects are going to appear. Will you pause with every page? Or will you let the child explore them beforehand? And then if the child shows an interest in something on a given page, then maybe there's another amount of time created to touch that object again, or to talk, sign about it, and so on. So those are decisions relevant to each individual child, and you use your expertise, your expert knowledge about the child to make those decisions. And then it's a nice idea to keep building on our use of the all done or finished bin. I love it when people just use a red bin, and red always means finished. I usually recommend that if you haven't already introduced something. And then as those objects are discussed and used, they go into the finished or all done bin then. You have to think about the position of the child and of the story box bin that you're using, the all done bin, and so forth. And then, of course, all of the usual things that you have to consider, like the length of the lesson, your pacing, how you're going to reinforce the child's efforts, and so on. So this picture then was that same teacher's classroom. She has the luxury of having a very large room. So what I like about this, and drove me to take this picture, is that for the children in her room, the blue boxes are all story boxes, these blue plastic bins. And you see the finished or all done sign, and that's associated with the red bin. When I filmed her during Morning Circle, she also had a big red bin. And so if they were handling objects and talking and signing about them, then the objects, when each child was done, also went in the red bin. So that always signified all done or finished. And I kind of like to use the term all done or finished according to our collaboration with the family and what they're using. So that's just a picture of how she had things organized then. And this was another area in her room. You can see on the left those bins. And then she had a whole reading station and a station for electronic literacy. And then she had some books from APH in this middle area, American Printing House for the Blind, excuse me, that she had available for the kids. I saw this image in Google Images, and I actually really, really like it. I picked it because it corresponds with the book I referenced earlier, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but I like it because it's sequencing the fruit that appeared in the book. Hopefully that's the correct sequence. I didn't go back to the book to check, but I think it might be. And then what it's interesting is that it also is pairing it with line drawings. I'm a big believer in the importance of pairing a more concrete representational form with something that's a bit more complex as a segue to getting the child to use something that might be more easily duplicated, like pictures if they have sufficient vision, and so on. So I have personally taught students where I paired objects with pictures when for years I was being informed by others, such as the SLP, that they had worked on pictures for years, and at a field of 2, the child wasn't right half the time. Not a good sign. But when we paired the picture with the object, and then I faded the object back, and when the child went to reach for the object, instead I gave a cue to reach for the picture and let them know it was the same, then we got them there, sometimes in a matter of months. I've done that with a number of children. It's worked really well. So I like that picture for that reason. But of course, line drawings are completely inappropriate for many children based on vision alone. All right, again, past the literacy reference or resource that I put on this slide. We also then, in addition to all these instructional decisions, we have roles then for team members, don't we, in relation to story boxes. If the child is in an inclusive setting, we might ask the general educator to let us know what books she's emphasizing if she's doing a read aloud so that we could create a story box that the intervener could use with the child, or that could be integrated into shared reading or read aloud to the class. The special educator, therapist, interveners, and parents can create and share story boxes. It would be great if you could have a duplicate of some of them so that they could be at school and at home, and you can kind of see how that also helps then with distancing, because we're sharing the same thing across different people. We're referring to a memory, we're drawing up memories, and all of that builds toward language. In terms of thinking then, continuing to think about families, we can help them to know about the importance of story boxes and not make them feel overwhelmed by this being like such a big undertaking. Some of these great story boxes and experience books as well have just a few objects, right? A few objects. So if they took the child to the farm, what did the child touch? What did the child get emotional about? And so on. Help them to understand saliency. Maybe show them a video of how you use a story box. Share a duplicate of it with a short description of what you did or a short video. Because remember, oftentimes these things that we take the time to develop, these lessons, might be used for months and months with a child before we're really ready to move on. So it's not like we're having to prepare it and it's only going to be used for a day or two. So it's better to take a little bit of time and be thoughtful. I always say to my students, my master's level students at BC, I always said, hold off a day or two until you have the time to get it set up the right way so we don't integrate mistakes. And then the kids are upset with us when we have to correct ourselves, and then introduce it when you're ready. So same thing for families. Remember that sharing affect and memories is really important to cognitive and emotional development. You might also, some of you have parent advisory council or volunteers who might be able to help with these, but you've got to give them some basic information, such as avoiding miniatures. People want to choose things that are visually pleasing because they're visual. The problem is much of the detail in miniatures is expressed in color. You can't touch it. So, and the other problem is that cognitively, it is much higher level skill than most people intuit to understand a model of something, a small model of something bigger. So we kind of save that for things that we can't touch, like a solar system when the child is ready for that kind of information. That's way down the road. So avoid miniatures. All right, let me pause here and see if there are any questions about story boxes.
Annie here, not seeing anything coming up.
Okay.
I think you're good to keep going.
All right, good. We'll get into experience books and maybe someone will have a question about story boxes later. So experience books. They will be individualized. So remember, that's having all the modifications of the curriculum, all of the accommodations that are needed, and they will be personalized. So an experience book is by nature personalized. It's about the child's lived experiences. And that's why I say we have this down. We've been doing this for a long time. Now we just need to use these terms correctly. These are also best, like story boxes, if they are created with the child. You can use objects, preferably collected with the child during the experience and based on the concept of saliency. What stood out to the child? You want to think about the key vocabulary that you're going to feature. So you're honoring saliency and thinking about the vocabulary that goes with the objects that you collected. You can label it in print so that sighted adults name it the same way, what they see in the book. And you can label it in Braille because perhaps that child will be a Braille reader. So this all depends on your functional vision assessments that you have on the child. And of course, how you share in speech or sign, we can also say is dependent on preferences of the family and the child, and also functional hearing. So we can use pictures and line drawings if visually appropriate. These personalized books will trigger memories, very important to communication development, and we can share them across environments, thus working on distancing. The child should assume over the years more responsibility for writing and for reading these experience books. You might also attach them with Velcro or use some sort of a surface where, you know, the object can be removed so the child can handle all of it. That's important when you're constructing them, because with the visual impairment, oftentimes the kids are touching part of it, but not all. And you want them to know what this representation is. And as soon as you affix it to a background, you've changed it, right? So you want to watch that, make sure they have a chance to explore it first and during the sharing of the book as well. And you want to store them where the child can locate them. Some of you might have read some of the work I've done on Colby. I'll have another chapter tracing his development from 4 to 21 coming out either this year or next year. And his mother kept those experience books. And you know what? Even as an adult, it was kind of fun for him to go back and remember what he was doing. And Colby has no functional vision. And so he isn't going to have the same experiences of sharing photographs, for example, that a sighted child might have. But these experience books are a fun way to go back and revisit who he was and what he did when he was young. So people talk about keeping these for a while, but you might want to have a historical batch of them also. Another child in one of my studies, the school had a huge collection, dozens of them that teachers had developed over the years. And I think she was a teenager when I saw her, close to 20. And so they had the ones that she was currently working on. She was now using the iPad a lot. And her mother was very actively engaged in creating stories on the iPad, but they still had a collection of these old books. And she got a kick out of going through some of them. I think of it as being like when we share family stories or family photo albums, you know, with our adult children. All right, so this gal I was just mentioning to you, this is actually a very simple page from an experience book they had done recently. She, and I believe it was her teacher, we don't have as many interveners here in the US. You're much better at that than we are. As Canadians, you really lead the way with interveners. So this is a page that just said we sat on a rock and took a picture. Yes, this young adult saw the rock, touched the rock, so it's a fairly good representation then. And apparently they spent some time there. And then she has another page. We walked some more and we saw trees. And so she's got just a piece of a small branch with leaves on it. And yes, it's going to get ugly over time, but that's okay. Then you can talk about that over time. This was another one she had. This particular teenager, young adult, had a series of books like Easter, her birthday, like special event books. And so this one would be good if she touched the candle. So I'm assuming she did. But I do want to point out that one thing you want to watch when you're creating these books is watch your glue. The only negative thing about this picture is you see a lot of glue residue. In the case of this child, she has significant functional vision. She is not really she is not primarily a tactile learner. If this child were a tactile learner, you really should be very, very careful about the glue, because what happens is they're touching it, and if they're not seeing it, that glue feels like it's actually part of the object. You see what I'm saying? So that's another case of take a little more time. You know, I know it's hard when you're creating it with the child because their hands might be in it, but do your best to make sure the glue isn't distracting tactually. For this child, it wasn't an issue. This is a page from her Easter experience book. So she liked to do egg hunts when she was younger, and so half of an egg works well. So then we have instructional decisions and strategies that we need to select. So one would be to select the objects for the experience books with the child, just like we did with the story boxes. If you can create it with the child, all the better, because now they're going to experience this collection of objects going into a book, right? So that will help them to make a connection. Try to connect emotions that occurred during the actual experience to shared reading. Um, so sometimes a child has an expression of tremendous emotion that belongs in that book because that's what's going to be most salient to them. So we can then talk about that emotion. You were very angry when that happened, or you were very happy when that happened, and that will help with building memory then. Again, we can work on book handling skills, top of the page, bottom, left to right, according to where the child is in terms of their development. We can design roles for you and for the child in shared reading, and I'm sure many of you have done this. They might turn the page, they might touch the objects on the page, then you might name them. I'm going to pause and say a phrase that I want you to remember: naming principle. That's another idea that we need to really think about in the field of deafblindness. Children will learn the vocabulary if you name it more often. And oftentimes, naming is not something we do a lot as teachers. We tend to ask a lot of questions as teachers, general and in special education. So make sure you keep naming things so that they're experiencing, whether you're assigning it, whether you're using speech to express it, whatever form you're using, keep naming it. Don't be afraid to do that so they can learn labels then. You want to store these, as I said, in an accessible place. So hopefully the child can access some of these on their own. I've seen children in classrooms that did that. They went over and got their own book because they wanted someone to share it with them, just like you would with a book in print without the experience book components. And remember that we will be repeating these readings over and over again. So I want to mention to you several really nice Canadian resources on experience books. The first one is Building Blake's Library. So if you haven't seen it already, it actually shows you pictorial examples of pages in experience books for one child named Blake, and that's why it's called Blake's Library. And then they have a place where they keep them that's labeled Blake's Library. So this child knows that those are his experience books. There's another one, this broadens out in terms of not being an example, but more a lot of rich information about how to do experience books. So this resource on experience books explains what they are, gives you the basic info that I've been talking about, but it also does something a little different that I haven't seen before on a site, and that is it separates it into 4 different categories of experience books. So you could do experience books about trips, and that's nice for distancing. You can do memory books. You can do concept books and also procedural books. So I have seen books like even on how to make a smoothie or a morning routine because they're working with a child on becoming more independent in their, getting ready in the morning kind of routine, or the opposite in the evening. So they had these 4 different categories and some examples. So it's very nice because it broadens our thinking. We tend to think of them as memory books, but to think of them in other ways is also helpful. And then the third resource is on routines. So you can click on that when you get the PowerPoint if you don't have it already. And this, again, reinforces in our thinking the importance of routines in our curriculum for predictability, right? For learning, for memory. So we never want to lose sight that deafblindness creates a certain amount of surprise in your life. Maybe not necessarily welcome surprise. And by personality, not just deafblindness or being hearing sighted, we have various tolerances for the amount of surprise in our lives or in an individual day, depending on whether we had a good night's sleep or not, right? So routines are really important because they help people feel emotionally safe. That's the most important thing. You want some predictability in your life, not to have everything be confusion. And we all know how much Van Dyke talked about making sense out of the chaos that individuals, especially those who are congenitally deafblind, experience. So routines, and then the connections between these routines and whatever goals you're working on, very important. So then there was also a couple of sites that had to do with concepts, and I really like this. So this blog post called The Bee Concept gives you a great deal of information, and it's a great time of year for it, isn't it? Boy, I saw the biggest bees I've ever seen last week in my yard. I'm like, what's going on? Things are huge this year. So bee concept book, some materials that you would need and how to construct a book about bees that corresponds to maybe a unit that's going on in science class, right? Whether it's an inclusive class or not. With tactile pictures and braille writing being featured in this particular example. So if you want to dig deeper and to look at a single example that's a concept book, this is a nice one. And then the other one is called Concept Development. And this is about, they start by setting the stage of differentiating skills from developing concepts. And then the importance of concept development and also the strategies that you can use to support concept development. So if you combined the link to the resource on concept books with the concept development link on this page, then that would be very, very helpful, I think, in your teaching, because we definitely do want to work on concepts. All right. So again, past literacy, I put a page in here for you, or a slide rather. All right. And again, we have to think about the team members and their roles. And I know we have different settings in which children are being educated. So the general educator, the paraeducator or intervener can share key events that are happening in an inclusive setting. And this can become an entire experience book, or maybe it's a page in an experience book. They can also help us with knowing what key vocabulary can be created. And of course, we have to honor people's individual roles. You know, we shouldn't be asking a paraeducator whose job is assigned for a certain set of hours to be spending time at night creating materials. I see that violated sometimes in the United States. So I would be careful about that. Special educator, therapists, interveners, and parents may co-create pages just like they worked on creating story boxes with the child or adult who is deafblind, of course, within the hours that their contract stipulates for their work, and shared reading then of the experience books across contexts for building distancing. And if you can create a duplicate of a couple of them to send home, all the better. So then what about families then? We can teach them the importance of experience books if they haven't already been exposed, for language development, for memory retrieval, and for sharing of emotions and processing emotions. We can invite them to share experience books that they might have created, give them some supports, maybe even send some materials to help them to create them. Like maybe we could send a blank book and they could add some objects. We've provided the materials. Perhaps then, as I said a moment ago, create an extra copy of an experience book that could be shared in the family home then, or do the interactive school journal, homeschool journal. All right, let me pause here and see if you have any questions then.
Sandy, I think I have you first here if you want
Okay.
to.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to just a comment at the end of the story box. And I've heard this before. It's not new that to try to avoid miniatures. And I have a question. In regards to like the example of Goodnight Moon or the Very Hungry Caterpillar, there are like, there's miniature fruit in the story box for that one, and there's a miniature cow and a miniature bunny.
Yeah.
And so I always run into this like the challenge, because we can provide pictures and maybe, sometimes we can have something to represent that, like the branch on the leaf represents a tree. but for bigger things like that, like animals,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm wondering if you can just talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. So what I would really pay attention is to what can be seen and what can be touched. So what often happens is that sighted people, meaning well, select miniatures because they're nice quality, right? You can purchase them, they appear nice, they're constructed well. The problem is when children are exploring those textually, or with low vision, will they be able to identify the key characteristics that you need them to notice? Like even for an animal, what defines a pig from a cow? Can you see it in that miniature? Can you touch it in that miniature? And then the other part of it is that color is often used in miniatures, and you can't see the color if you're blind. So then you can't pick out the mouth, and the mouth is so small you can't feel it because it's not really indented. It's not open, like the animal's eating. So we tend to say avoid miniatures because they're so abused. But those are really the judgment calls I think you make when you consider. Now, if a child already has a miniature for something and they know the meaning, I would never change it. You don't take away someone's words or their representations. I would leave it alone. But other than that, we tend to use parts of objects, like parts of the tree branch, that you would use. Now, miniatures may be very, very tiny, or they could be larger. So, when we develop models, we're often miniaturizing, and we can't help but do it because the thing it's representing is too big. So I don't want to be so strict that what I'm saying is misconstrued. Sometimes we will be creating models, usually for more experienced children who are already linguistic, though. So those would be the guidelines. So if it's a set like the Goodnight Moon or something else, then I would say you have to look at the set, as I mentioned earlier, and think about the level of comprehension of the child you're working with and how much vision they have, how much they have tactile abilities and rely on tactile exploration, and whether or not that particular smaller version of something can represent the concept you're trying to teach well. So, it's always good to close our eyes or put a sleep shade on and feel it to see. I do the same thing when I make tangible representations to see if the quality of it has changed, especially with textures like materials, they flatten over time and they don't feel the same. So those would be my basic guidelines. Let me see if you have another question based on the
No,
input.
no, that's good. Really, essentially, it's just your decision based on personalizing it for that specific child's needs and abilities and vision and yeah, specific to that child.
That
It's
would be
not a steadfast.
Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
individualizing, personalizing. So yes, you're on the right track. You're thinking
Okay.
about accommodations and so
Yeah.
forth. But the
Okay.
problem is sighted people are thinking like sighted people, just like hearing
Yes.
people think like hearing people. And we're like, oh, isn't that cute? Isn't that nice? And I'm talking about these little miniatures sometimes that are, this big,
Right.
an elephant or a pig. And this relates a lot to categorization later. I've been doing some reading and thinking about categorization again as a pivotal milestone and how children have to define what's a critical feature, or we could say salient, about a representation in order to understand its connection to the larger thing you're representing. So miniatures plays into that too. So when we're thinking about miniatures, people are usually talking about things that are quite small, cute and small, right? As opposed to just a smaller version of something huge or something you can't touch because it's up, out in space or something. So yeah.
Okay.
Email
That's
if you want to talk some more, okay?
no, that
Yeah.
that's helpful. Yeah. That's what
Yeah, I would just basically, if you're the one with expertise in deaf blindness, you're going to be able to make good judgments. For the other folks you're working with, just set a rule, no miniatures, and then they
right.
won't make mistakes. That's kind of how I think of it, frankly.
Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank
All
you.
right. Was there another question, Annie?
Yeah, we had one more from
Okay.
Adam. So if you want to go ahead, Adam.
Oh, okay, Adam.
Sure. Hi, Dr. Bruce.
Hi.
I'm really curious about the connection between the students' emotional responses to the
Ah,
experience books. And because you've really got me thinking about this as a whole other dimension or layer to the
Yeah.
experience books. But I'm curious about your thoughts on when we're rereading an experience book with a student, resharing that book,
Yeah.
are we looking to remind or kind of make connections back to the student's
Yes.
emotional responses, or are we only going with the emotions that are elicited in the here and now in that rereading?
It could be either or both. And you just brought up such an important thing that I probably should have emphasized more. So emotion, whether it's negative or positive, but as teachers, we tend to build on the positive, right? That draws up our memories. It's
Right,
ocean
right,
is very connected. So one thing I wish I had more emphasis on, and now you're helping me with it, is it's really important with those early exposures to the experience book after you create it. It's really best if someone who is there for the experience does those initial readings with the child because they were there for the emotion,
right.
right? Like I was on a school trip and a child, oh God, for the first time, he threw his shoe in a place we couldn't get it. He threw it down a latrine. And I mean the kind you don't flush. And then he's horribly angry because his teachers can't retrieve it this time, nor can we support him to retrieve it. That was a salient moment. So in an experience book for something like that, you'd have to make a decision then, knowing that this child is going to be angry, but then it might give you an opportunity to process that anger and tie in language to it. And in a way, it's respectful because that camping experience for that child was about losing something that could not be retrieved.
Right.
You know, another time I had a child in my home, the parent brought the child over, and I had all of these things ready for the child to experience. But really, the two things that were most salient about that child's experience in my home were not what I planned. They were biting into a piece of cute little soap I left on. I don't do this anymore, but I had a shaped soap in my bathroom, and the child decided to take a bite. I can only imagine because the scent drew her in, and I should have thought about that. And the other thing was, I had objects on the deck, and instead, this child played with the broom and was plucking straw from the broom. So when we put together some objects to represent visiting Susan, yep, the soap went with the child, and then we monitored that the child didn't eat it. Negative experience. And some pieces of the broom went
Right,
too, right?
right,
So that's what I mean about it. In a way, it's about being respectful, like paying attention to what's important to someone else.
right. Oh,
You know,
thank you. That's really helpful.
yeah, a trip to your in-laws, which you remember could be different than your partner or your spouse, right? Different experiences. It happens outside of deaf blindness.
Right.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll move on. So this one, I know I'm being a little bit on the edge here, calling this a literacy lesson, but I decided I would because I want people to pay attention to it. So this work for me was driven again by the field and people saying, especially parents saying, oh my gosh, they say my child makes a selection from a field of 5 and I don't believe it. Or I observe this in the school setting and they're waving the thing they want the child to select and this is not working. So choice making needs to be authentic. And especially when we're talking with parents, let's not pretend they're making a selection with meaning unless they are. So I differentiate between offering choice making opportunities and a child actually making authentic, meaningful choices. They're connected, we hope, but they aren't always the same thing at the same time. So choice making, the reason I think it is connected to literacy is it does involve symbols or representations, if not symbols. It involves some kind of paying attention, drawing attention, listening in some way, not necessarily with the ears. It involves sequencing of options. It involves communication. And it can also be embedded within other literacy lessons, like when we're constructing the daily schedule. For a child who's a little more advanced, we might put in a choice, maybe even a choice of which independent tasks, or not independent, which supported tasks to do first during tabletop activities in a set of 3. Choice making for what's salient to include in story boxes and so on. All right, so vocabulary then. This is outside the field of deaf blindness, but very accepted terms. The things we offer are not choices, although we all slip into calling them that. They are options. They are the possibilities. The representation is the icon or symbol we use to represent the options. And we might use, and a good place to begin is to use actual objects then, the actual thing itself. The way they tell us what they select is called the selection response or indicating response. So that's how they will make the selection. The funniest one I saw, and I caught it on tape, much to my surprise and the teacher, he had 3 snack bags on a nice slant board, beautifully set up. The child was perfectly capable of reaching for or doing a point approximation. The child leaned forward and licked the one they wanted. Not the selection response we were looking for, but very clear preference expressed. So we work on selection responses then. And then the array is the number of options you're presenting, and then you have the presentation of the array, how you're going to do it. So it might be one at a time. It might be paired choice, paired options. It might be a larger array and so on. So then we have to think about all the things that are involved to make this meaningful. The child must have the background experience. Never lose sight of the importance of repeated experiences in deafblindness. So critical. If you don't know what it is, then you don't know if you really want to select it. Think of all the things we don't know much about. There's many mechanical parts you could hold up and offer me these 2 options, and I probably wouldn't care, and I might not even participate. We then need to know, beyond knowing what the options are, the things you're selecting, you have to know the representations for the options. And this is what I want to emphasize. This is not the time to teach the meaning of a sign or a line drawing or a picture. This is not a test. Authentic choice making means we're being respectful and that we want to know what the child really wants. This is not a time to make them tell us the same thing 3 times before we let them have it, or anything around teaching. Line drawings is the one I see all the time. So teachers tend to get pretty upset when someone else is doing line drawings and holding up 2 line drawings, and then I might ask, oh, the child understands. I might make a comment, oh, the child understands line drawings. And the teacher looks at me and says, or says later when the child's not there, actually, I can't name a single line drawing my student understands that I can be sure of. No, wrong. That's not to be happening in choice making. I'm just really big on this because when you pause and think about it, this is not a time to test. This is a time to find out what they want. So we want them to be successful and understand what we're showing. I mean, imagine how you would perceive that if somebody held something up, like my example about mechanical things, and you had no idea of what these things were. Then it would be kind of either not interesting at all or maybe insulting. So also in the beginning, we want to offer options. I keep holding up 2 hands because I'm thinking of a paired selection. We want to offer them options that are of different levels of preference for beginners because they're still learning perhaps what the choice making is. And because others may have done it in an inauthentic way, it might take us a while to undo the damage, frankly. So we also want to make sure they have an indicating or selection response that is efficient. The efficiency principle in communication is essential. So that could be reaching. Remember, many of them will not yet be pointing. They might have a point approximation. They may have physical disabilities that prevent them from reaching and pointing, but they might have a nice, solid gaze toward the one they prefer. So that's fine. It could be, I've worked with children that are very involved, it's their breathing that changes when they see or touch the thing they really want, or perhaps they hear a short passage of music that they particularly want more than another passage. We want to be thoughtful about the number of options we present. We have to consider the wait time. Think about auditory processing. Think about visual processing. Think about motor latencies. Consider where to present it in the visual field and make sure your teacher of students with visual impairments advises you about that. So if there's missing information in the superior visual field, you don't want to have this being offered way above the child's eye line, right? You want to bring it down. You want to think about that. Watch for position bias, and they're selecting things always on the right or the left, and so on. You'll want to be careful with consistent vocabulary. This is a team project to determine how you're going to do this and what your vocabulary will be. Now, for beginners, they're going to select things they don't really want because they weren't paying attention or they don't understand this process yet, or people have been doing it with them in a way that wasn't helpful to their learning. So they get what they select, but then as part of your team decisions, you have decided how long they're going to have this thing they don't want and exactly what you're going to say to them. Oh, you don't want that. Let's try again, or let's make a choice, or something like that. You'll have a phrase that you use, that you speak and you sign. And over time, that will gain in meaning for the child then. Systematic preference assessment can help you to identify options. That's another whole topic. But otherwise, your knowledge of the child, watch for satiation. You know, if they've had this this object or this item used as reinforcement a lot during that day, then they may not choose it, even though you generally think they like it better because they've just had kind of enough of it that day. So also be aware that we have a little bit of evidence that children with severe disabilities are quite context dependent. They may prefer one thing in a particular setting and another in a different setting. And they may also connect what they like most to who they're with, which is kind of a beautiful thing. But we often do that. We'll make choices, we'll make selections because we're with a particular person and we know what they like or what they expect. So then you have team decisions around the options, the size of the array, how you're going to present it, as I said, the visual field, your vocabulary, and how long to present each option. And the pause, try to avoid leaking clues. Common things we see in classrooms would be adults leaning forward with the thing they think the child wants. They're trying to be kind, I know. Or they're being more dramatic with it, waving it around. And then the other thing is like, whoa, way back here, and very stable in terms of movement. So don't leak clues. They get what they select and collaborate with the family. We shouldn't use all of the child's high preferences if they do cross contexts. We shouldn't use them all up in school. Let's save some for the families. All right. What questions might you have on choice making or our other topics from today?
Nothing so far in the chat, but
Okay, I'll give it another minute. I did give you some references, and I might say this one on the struggle to symbolism and the distancing one, even though they're from '05, this came from, oh my gosh, deep study of this early work on which Van Dyke actually built his work in part from the work of Werner and Kaplan. So that's a good reference. And there's one on individualizing and personalizing that I did with Marlene Janssen and Susan Bashinsky. Again, building on the work in early childhood for our field because we're really good at personalizing. And then some other references. And of course, all of the resources that were shared should be helpful. All right. Any questions?
I think that's it for questions.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I want to thank the interpreters. I know I sped up toward the end. I wasn't quite sure I was going to have enough time, but we ended up fine. Thank you.
I want to say thank you, Dr. Bruce. I've been making notes steady the whole time you've been speaking, and you really, I think all of what you talked about with story boxes, experience books, distancing, I think there's going to be a lot of really great conversations with a lot of our teams in the next little while. I have lots of sound bites. I was writing down, they're almost like mantras, how you wrote them, like building on success, saliency, from the student's perspective, individualizing versus personalizing literacy. Distance is important in understanding symbols, teaching to distancing. Yeah, I've got lots of little sound bites.
When you read linguistic literature and literature from psychologists as well, and you realize how much language is supported by this process of distancing, you come to appreciate what a huge advantage hearing and vision are toward that process. And so those issues would be um, challenging for someone who's deaf,
Mhm.
someone who's blind, but especially for someone who's deafblind, because those are our two distant senses for learning. Smell is just not very dependable, right, for learning. So it doesn't help us with language, but yeah, but we can address that, as you were saying, by teaching to distancing, and then we get the kids there faster. And I know, and with their sense of themselves in a intact in a positive way, right? Rather than, it really bothers me when I see a lot of testing without teaching. We don't get it in our field so much. We see it in another field in special ed a lot with certain approaches, and so the idea is to give them the opportunities to have a lot of experiences and tie it to rich language then. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is
All right.
excellent. Thank you.
Good.
Your
Thank you.
presentation is on our website now, so if anybody missed it, you're welcome to watch it. And this one will be available in the next couple of weeks. And I also want to say thank you for highlighting the PopTV resources too. And
Oh,
we're
sure.
always to expand and grow. And if people have more things they'd like to share or um, help us build their section out, that would be great.
Oh, they were really good resources. I enjoyed very much reading them and at different levels, basic foundational information, but then some that were at a high level of specificity.
Mhm.
So I think that's great, especially around the concept development is very, very nice.
For
Yeah.
sure. Always be
Well,
developing concepts, right? That's
yes, that's right. That's a whole nother topic, but a good one. Yes, for sure.
absolutely.
All
Okay.
right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's nice to see my friends in British Columbia then. Take care, all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.